exciting for me to be here because you are at such a pivotal moment in time. So what we are going to discuss today are the results of work at both Harvard University and Cornell, much of which is really the result of students that have worked with us. I teach online at Harvard, where we've had students from a good 30, 40 countries that are all researching the same issues that you're grappling with in their own home destinations. And that's what's really enabled me as a facilitator and professor to come to some of the conclusions you're going to hear today. Just to remind you, and I believe that you have had some good reminders, that tourism is a proven GDP and employment driver. There's no question that you are succeeding here. That's without question. You're seeing all of these great statistics on movement towards further tourism in the region. And most importantly, so much more employment is being driven by that. So this is a wonderful success story that you're working with, and something that you have to keep in mind as we discuss some of the questions of sustainability. Tourism is not only steadily growing here, of course, it's growing throughout the world at about 4% annually, which is double the global GDP growth. But there's some changes that are happening, as we all know, in how tourism is distributed, which is through, of course, the digital economy. Those booking engines that you see at the top there are taking a larger and larger percentage of the profits from the rest of the tourism industry. It also is driving more growth, but it's changing the percentage distribution of how much actually reaches the destination. So what is the history of destination management? As you know, we're going through a lot of discussions on that. What exactly is the responsibility of all of the different players that are working within the destinations? You have the local attractions, which were discussed very articulately this morning. Your historical, natural, and cultural monuments are absolutely your linchpins that are bringing your tourists. It is the #1 reason in most cases that people come to a place, is to see some of these attractions. It is these attractions that therefore promote the higher GDP in your region. But as we've been hearing, many of these places are becoming very, very crowded, especially in peak seasons. And some of them are literally cracking under the weight of visitation in peak seasons. They're struggling around the world with how do you manage this amount of people arriving all at the same time. So one of the things that we've been looking at Cornell is the fact that tourism growth, of course, brings higher GDP, but the question is, what are the costs of that growth? And as we all know, even in business, when you have growth, you have to invest. As we were discussing here, an investment is happening with new visitor centers, the Johnny Walker, all of those are terrific examples of investment in your region. But there will also need to be investment in the management of visitors. This is inevitable. As more and more people come, you cannot leave that unmanaged. It has to be managed in order to create visitor flows that will not damage your attractions. So local facilities right now don't, in most cases, have a solution to this problem. It's not clear, even in the most famous attractions in the world, exactly how they're going to manage this in future. There's many good theories. We can go into a Q&A on the question of how will attractions manage themselves in future. Oh, what happened there? Destination management systems, though, in general, require innovation and full systems analyses. So a lot of places right now seem to be making rapid decisions too quickly because of the pressure. And what really needs to happen is much more analysis of the system of management of tourism flows. So crowding is a symptom of what can be, we have discovered, a larger problem. And that is that tourism requires extra infrastructure to meet growing demand. Now, this includes utilities. Utilities are under the ground, but they actually provide essential services to the cities and to tourists. When it comes to tourism, we see that, of course, they come in peak seasons. And so therefore, they drive a peak demand for all of the services that are pictured here that frequently can drive costs well above what would normally be the case if it was only local residents in the area. And often, many scholars have found that tourists use, say, 8 to 10 times more water than local citizens. And they frequently use more energy, especially in warm seasons, because of air conditioning. And so what that does is drive a change in your city planning procedures as to how to manage that demand. And yet, very few places are doing that yet. So why are we seeing the over-tourism crisis now? Certainly, there's some very clear answers to that question. One is the growth of the Chinese middle class. You're seeing an enormous number of visitors from Asia in general who are traveling in ways that they never were able to do a generation before. And so this is creating a complete change in the types of visitors that are coming to destinations around the world and how many will be coming. Also, travel has just become more affordable. Our airline costs have really gone down. Here in Europe, you have all of these very inexpensive short-haul flyers that are making it possible to even go to other European destinations or to Edinburgh for the weekend. All of these parties that are now going on around the European cities, that wasn't happening, again, a generation ago. So those are new phenomena. And then the biggest of all, of course, is the digital travel revolution. So what we're finding in destination after destination is that they are being stretched a little bit beyond their tolerance. People are starting to get uneasy. They're starting to wonder what's going to happen. So at Cornell, with our new publication that comes out in March, we're calling this the invisible burden. It's often very difficult to actually account for what that burden is and what it means. And so in the publication, and today I'm giving you a preview of what we have found. Essentially, the study first started in Rhodes, Greece, with one of my students who looked at this infrastructure here and by way of how much it was costing the Greek economy. And what she found, she was Greek, is that actually they had to build a whole new coal-fired power plant in order to accommodate tourism and their electricity needs. And that every Greek citizen was paying €1.37 every year in order to actually subsidize the energy required on just Rhodes, Greece. That was a very statistically oriented study that we have continued to look at, and what we are finding is that this invisible burden often has to do with utility costs. So in general, my book here looks at this from the point of view of case studies from around the world. It looks very strategically at each industrial sector of the tourism economy, from cruise ships to hotels to tour operators, and looks in general at how much they're doing and how much they're achieving cost efficiencies together with sustainable efficiencies in their work, and then how that can be fit into the larger picture of destination management. So the question I'm raising today is, will our destinations, given these trends, which no one anticipates will really be particularly slower unless we have a gigantic global crisis, which could happen, of course, or smaller crises that may impede people from coming rather temporarily. But as we've discussed today, we're really seeing that tourism is not even really, it's very resilient, that you may see a slowdown temporarily, but the demand for tourism is so great that it quickly recovers. So as a result, we expect a good 20, 30 years of tourism growth, certainly here, especially with all the beautiful new facilities that are being discussed that you're going to be building. So without management or maintenance of tourism destinations, it can happen that you'll see so much overcrowding that you can start to lose value per tourist. And this is our biggest concern that we're pointing out to everyone, every destination around the world, that they're actually not doing the accounting that they need to do in order to even understand if they are making money as a destination because of the invisible burden. So these threats of overdeveloping tourism destinations are, without question, real, all right? These are not things that can really be left without discussion. Now, some people, I think that it might be better not to discuss this, and some of you may have that opinion. So overall, it's best to address an issue early on. So these local managers of vital resources and infrastructure here in Scotland really need to make sure that their destination is actually not in debt in order to manage tourists, because we're seeing this in more than one case, and that those costs are actually not being transferred to local citizens as they are in Greece in order to pay for the consequences. So, how can we address this? So this is the rest of my discussion today, and I really welcome questions. If you want to get on Slido and start getting those in there, I would look forward to a discussion. But our overall recommendation is that what we have is city planners and tourism planners frequently maybe not having the common language that they need in order to make really good decisions, because while the citizens may be weighing in, they may not be weighing in for both tourism planners and city planners, and also rural planners. So all in all, we need a more interactive dialogue that allows all of Scotland, and certainly Edinburgh, to achieve future value, not just current value, to project out how you're going to achieve that future value and to drive innovation. I'm struck with the presentation about Johnny Walker, that was great, about the amount of innovation, and just visiting here in general, Scottish culture is so clearly driven by innovation. And I think this is timely here at University of Edinburgh. I'm walking by sign after sign telling me about the importance of your future and how you can future-proof it, prepare now for all the changes, and use the brilliant students that you have here too in order to make that happen. I believe innovation can actually deal with some of these issues. And one of the primary things that we recommend, and this comes out of the Harvard Graduate School of Design, is this graphic where there, instead of just regular plans with consultation, that there is a constant cycle of consultation now that is driven by some more data-driven technological tools that I'm going to talk about. So planning and people-based growth now, as we all know, is more possible by using data. We can, go towards having people weigh in, as we're doing with Slido today, much more frequently, and use that data to begin to drive innovation and thinking about how we want to organize tourism in future. And also, just from a very important technical perspective, in order to know what's happening, assuming that you're going to have change, just assuming it. Somebody compared tourism in Edinburgh to a frog in water, with the water turning up and not realizing really how this change is starting to boil them, right? To create change that's perhaps going to cause problems. So how do you prevent that? By benchmarking. That's exactly what you have to have, are indicators that tell you when things are not going the way you want, and be able to look at those on a consistent basis over time. So that just gets down to, well, what do we need to measure, right? I mean, because we have for so many decades in the tourism field measured what we consider to be perhaps a too limited number of types of metrics. Those metrics tend to look at growth primarily. How many tourists are coming? What kind of economic growth are we having? That's, of course, fundamental, and that is one of the primary metrics. But in this era, hopefully, of sustainability, when we're going to be dealing with climate change and sociocultural impacts in our cities, we have to measure both environmental and sociocultural metrics as well in order to know if we're boiling or not. And that often is not measured. Sociocultural metrics are still very new, and environmental metrics are also relatively new in tourism planning. And we tend to just bucket that off as sustainability. But in fact, it's actually your destination, and its environmental and sociocultural well-being, as we've heard today, is fundamental to your tourism offer. And if people are feeling that it's not working well, even if you have the best human resources situation in the world, it's going to be harder and harder to give an impression to the public that everything is going well. So it's very important to think these things through. So what would we call a smart destination? Smart destinations are a hot topic in Europe, as you've probably heard. A lot of that has to do with managing market demand. But what half of your obligation in future here will be, well, what about our market supply? How are we going to manage that, and how are we going to protect it? So we have to look at our historic city centers, our monuments, our vital ecosystems, and our sociocultural systems. This is the modern, new way that we'll actually be able to know if tourism is going well. So how do we do that? What are the requirements? There's some really good systems out there for doing this kind of thing. Urban planners and protected area planners have been doing this kind of thing for generations. They look at science-based data to identify critical tipping points. When are things just going a little bit beyond what we would want? And then we make sure that there's regular local participation and regular monitoring. So how do we make this all happen in a way that just seems like you can pull up the graph and chart that you need, right? Because that's really half of it, is just being able to get access to all of the data that you need without it becoming this huge, cumbersome task. And it shouldn't be anymore. And the reason is GIS. GIS planning, which is taught here, and there's a program here at University of Edinburgh on this, can be built in very naturally to managing these indicators. And as you can see in this slide here, you can see how you can use layers of maps to look at everything from climate to ecology to sources of water and to historic cultural issues and even sort of visual perceptions that people have. Say when they go to the castle, one thing that we do as planners is ask people for their visual perception of when they're perceiving crowding. And different cultures perceive that in different ways. Some people are less bothered by crowding than others. And so protected area planners, say for example in US national parks, have been doing this for decades. And they have worked out systems where they can use that data to make decisions on how to manage the parks and monuments. So some of you, many of you are representing businesses, and you may be wondering, is this going to be good for my business? Because after all, if we are talking about limiting numbers, which I haven't said, you may notice I haven't said anything about limiting numbers yet anyway, and that's always an issue. Like, do we want to stop the economy? Do we want to slow down the tourism economy? Not necessarily. I don't think that that's proven to be the case. But what we do want to do, as I think everyone agrees, is make sure that as tourism business expands, that we won't increasingly face these overloaded destinations without the first aid that we've pictured here, without more thought behind the management process. So in our research at Harvard Business School, for example, they've spent a lot of time looking at environmental and social and governance by way of how investors view business. And they've looked at every type of multinational business in the world, it seems like, except tourism, by way of how much business prospers by way of if they look at their risks farther in advance. And of course, you're in the situation right now to look at risks farther in advance. You're looking at a 10-year plan. This is a really important time to consider your risks. So what they found is if you look at the risks farther in advance, it stabilizes your performance and therefore actually makes companies more consistently profitable. So is there any other, I keep hearing about budget cuts a lot here since I arrived, and I understand that there is a fiscal environment that is redistributing itself, really, in many ways. There's arguments about taxes. There's an overall look at where is the money coming from in order to manage the tourism phenomenon. I won't be addressing the specifics of that. But when we look at this from the perspective of where can societies such as yours look for this type of investment in future, we do believe that you need to redistribute resources and consider where they're coming from in order to protect your destination. And you're in a really good period of time to do that. Again, any economy, any business in the world that is growing as consistently as tourism has a lot of security to make really sound decisions because you know that the economy isn't going to really falter that much. The demand is too high. All right? So therefore, you can afford to be innovative. You can afford to take those Johnny Walker risks and really go for it by way of using innovation to think about how, in future, you can cover the invisible burden. So these models will require investment from business and government. This is our newest conclusion. We're open to input on it, but what we are seeing is that in general, certainly here in Britain, but in general in the OECD countries, they're all facing these budget cuts uniformly. The government will not 100% save the tourism economy by way of taking care of, the Leaning Tower of Pisa and making sure it doesn't fall down, which each one of your monuments, each one of your vital attractions is going to need reinforcement. So the question is, how do you face it now, and how do you potentially create finance platforms of the future that can be sure that you're driving value back into places that are so crucial to your economy? So, taxes. I mean, you're already having that dialogue. A lot of places aren't. When I heard that you were, I actually felt that you were lucky. I know that seems like you're crazy, right? But in fact, a lot of places are not having this dialogue at all. They're just going with what the tax formula is. And generally around the world, although there's almost no studies of this, we have looked high and low, we estimate that 80% of tourism taxes go to marketing, all right? Now, if you look at supply and demand, you really, in general, this is just a formula, you need to think about that in future. Given that we have this kind of steady tourism demand in the global economy, it could be that that needs to be redistributed so that there's enough of the resources available from the tax economy, whatever you decide it should be, that goes towards protection of what I'm calling the supply, which is your destination. Because if you don't invest in your destination to protect it, it will be run down. I often, my favorite parallel would be just picture a business that put 80% of their profitable revenue into marketing and less than 20% into maintenance. What do you think would happen? The business would be damaged. They wouldn't be able to keep up with the demand, and they would undermine their factory, and it would ultimately not operate and could go out of business. Now, I think many of us are not really thinking of destinations as businesses, but what we're arguing at both Harvard and Cornell is that there's many parallels, actually, that it is your attractions, your common pool resources that you're depending on, and so therefore a redistribution may be necessary, is what we're suggesting. So in order to decide, well, what's fair, what's transparent, this came up with our Destinations Leaders program on Monday, which I joined a wonderful group of folks here to discuss this with. And there was a lot of discussion about transparency. So apparently that needs to be fully kept in mind, that if there was ever a redistribution or a relook at taxes, you need to have transparency as to where that money would go. That is for sure. But there's something else that you would need, which we're recommending, which is holistic accounting. Now, holistic accounting doesn't just look at gross GDP and what's going into your economy, because what we are arguing is that with the invisible burden, you are actually not looking at net. You are not looking at what is the net to your economy. And no, you're not alone. We're actually feeling a little, like we're very excited about this launch of this new publication in many ways, but we're also finding it a little frightening, to be frank, because we're telling the entire tourism world that they're not using the appropriate metrics to measure success. But we believe it's very merited what we're saying, because we have hundreds and hundreds of cases to show it's the case, that the tourism economies are not looking at their local costs. Why is that? Because they aren't measuring locally, they're just looking at frequently national or regional statistics. And the local costs appear in different ledgers at the local authority level. So, what are we saying? That you have to combine those metrics and look at, of course, national and regional demand together with local costs in order to understand if you're actually doing as well as you think. And so what are the benefits of that? One, if you have such a holistic accounting system, you can measure the invisible burden. Two, from a global sustainability perspective, you can start to report much more reliably on how you're going to meet your sustainable development goals, which the world is working on right now. And also, you can actually measure your GHG, or your carbon emissions per tourist. Now, I can assure you that's going to be important in future. The tourism economy is one of the most unmeasured economies for carbon impacts. Now, we all know that air is a big part of that, but not as big as we may think. Destinations also have a major responsibility in future to understand how are we going to transition to a greener economy. And that green economy, of course, will require more renewable energy. And more renewable energy will come at a transition cost. Simple as that, right? So if you don't know how much energy the tourism economy requires, you don't know to what level the tourism economy actually could be contributing to the transition to renewable energy. But we know just statistically that it could absolutely be contributing to that transition. And I hope you all join me in the hope that we all can make that transition on a global basis to a society that isn't as dependent on fossil fuels. Because if we don't achieve that, we can be discussing the problem of climate change, but actually we're not fully acting on it. And so we have found that, in fact, it might be easier to do this at the destination level because it involves everyone. So just to say, we've been testing such a framework at Harvard, and we finished the first test of what we're calling the International Sustainable Tourism Initiative framework for measuring the emissions from tourism and the utility costs at the local level so that you can actually measure the invisible burden. So I'm wrapping early so we can have hopefully more questions. What we see in future is something that will be a vision of a different kind of global green economy where tourism is a fully part of that transition. Right now, I think we're talking a good game, but frankly, we're not really doing it. But I think I'm likely to believe here that you all believe in this green transition. And so therefore, the question is, how are we going to achieve it? And we think that the creation of destination platforms of the future for investment is possible. It might mean, and it's just one example, of creating safe trust funds for international and national investments in qualifying green destinations. Now, we know, as we circle back now to the question of the green economy and the digital economy, that we have this cycle in which the digital economy is driving, rapid growth, and yet we're not seeing that we're covering the costs locally, and certainly not the cost of transition to a green economy. Right? So what we may have to do is look at how to get more of those digital economy revenues into a safe place that can actually be invested in local qualifying green destinations that are measuring their holistic costs. So I hope I haven't hope I've created a clear picture for you of the vision that we have of a new, greener world with destinations that are measuring their costs, that are understanding how to manage the growth in a way that will be not only beneficial to the tourists, but also to your local economy and the people living here. So hopefully we have some questions.
That's great. Thanks a lot, Megan. And thank you to everyone who's been using Slido to bring their questions in. I think, Kim, we have some questions put in. Let's start at the top. Other models where tourists contribute to sustainability. How do tourists think about the sustainability as part of the experience?
Yeah, well, there's many. I mean, I come out of the field of ecotourism and also any model where there's sustainable, it's called sustainable tourism, where companies around the world and here in Scotland too are designing their profitable exercises, be it a tour operator, hotels, even cruise lines, where they're looking, of course, at their overall environmental footprint, and they're seeking to reduce that footprint. So that's the number one thing that I address really heavily in my book. How can these different sectors manage their footprint, which of course is really important. But now this question of how can companies actually contribute to the well-being of a destination, that's newer. We're seeing it, I think, a little less in urbanized environments because the need hasn't really been perceived as much as it is now. But in rural economies, in my experience, and I've worked in over 30, 40 countries at this point, is that there is a lot of opportunity for private business to give back through employment, but also through very well-designed social responsibility programs, of which there are hundreds, if not thousands, of examples of that. So yes, we have the business models. We know that they exist. We know that they work. But now we need to apply them a little bit more concertedly to the destinations like Edinburgh in future.
Okay. Let's go with the top one. How do we get the big tech and digital companies to contribute to the costs of managing destinations in reality?
Well, as I said, I'm only tentatively raising that now because I wanted to spark your imagination. I have not personally, although I do hope to get into that conversation and why I'm raising it with you. I believe that destinations themselves will need to think about this, and they may want to work together. When I was in Copenhagen, we had the exact same discussion. I'm heading to Stockholm. So there is this sense, I believe, that destinations are understanding that they may need to work together to discuss how to get some reinvestment.
Is there evidence that the next generation of tourists will make decisions based on whether destinations are responsible in green or other reputational terms?
Well, you know, I've been following this closely for decades, and we've always thought that tourists would make green decisions. But when you look at the internal studies of big corporations like TUI, for example, TUI's, you know, makes their consumer research open to the public. So, you know, we're able to actually look at the corporate decision making that they're making on this topic. And it's gone from being like number 6 in a tourist consideration, in other words, not in the top 10, to I think it might be up to 4 now. So a big corporation like that is a good indicator. What they're seeing is, yes, that the millennials are in somewhat changing how decision-making is happening. They're using their apps, you know, they're looking at questions of sustainability, but there's a problem with this. I mean, unless you're a big corporation like TUI that actually publishes all their sustainability reports, it's difficult to get reliable, comparable information about that for the consumer. So the tourist is really not yet the reliable driver for sustainability in destinations.
Okay. Do you feel there should be additional legislation in this area to trigger change?
Well, I think that there needs to be a balance of legislative initiative together with what as I was saying, innovative practices that can, and more research. One thing that I think we lack in tourism, to be frank, is enough research and development. We don't spend enough time before we make decisions. And this could be the biggest decisions that you're making in your lives as it relates to tourism right now. So what I would recommend is that your legislators have a look at all of these holistic questions before they start legislating.
Okay. Which global destinations are addressing the co-design approach well?
Well, you know, we're teaching a course on this. In fact, it actually has the first class tonight, and I'm going to be missing that. But we've been searching high and low for good examples. Each destination seems to be getting a piece of it. It's like they have the elephant out there. Each one of them is feeling out a piece of it. But our course is on regional planning, sustainable tourism, and GIS, because we really want our new, you know, our next generation destinations to have this kind of powerful capacity to use data to make decision making. So right now, it's a little difficult to judge from a technical perspective, because what we're seeing is a lot of what we call anecdotal evidence, or even destinations that are touting themselves as green, but we don't see the data out there to prove it almost anywhere. But there's been some good plans. I mean, Barcelona is certainly, you know, doing a good plan. Copenhagen is doing a good plan. The country of Belize, we're now using these as readings for our course. The country of Belize has done a good plan, you know, that's pretty old. So what they've done is a little bit more of a holistic look at how their destination can prosper in the future using, you know, very relevant metrics that are triple bottom line.
Is there a contradiction between digital economy and sustainable tourism, given that data centers, cloud storage is worse for the environment than air travel? Okay.
Well, that's a great question. I really hadn't thought about that. So I can't really answer that. But I think the way my overall thinking is that we're never going backwards when it comes to innovation and new ways of managing society or in the digital revolution. So even if there is a contradiction, which there might be, it's a question of how do you manage the contradiction.
Are there any cities who are really measuring the impact of tourism effectively?
Well, we think it's still very limited. As I said, I think this whole idea of the invisible burden is very new. And so we're doing it as a way of suggesting that it's possible, because the whole question of how you measure sustainability, we're reframing it. And we're reframing it in a very important way, which I didn't address, which is economists will talk about sustainability in terms of, as I said, GDP, and then maybe, possibly looking at the cost to attain sustainability. Those are very econometric. But what we're suggesting is something that we're calling operational sustainability, not just using economics. What does that mean? That this kind of accounting will have to happen at the city level, not just with economists, because they're the ones using their own utility bills that will be able to begin to measure the impacts. And as I was saying, we just tested this with Harvard experts to see if it was possible to do at the city level. And what we found is that actually it is. It's not even remotely impossible. And so we're therefore not using theoretical constructs to measure. We're using actual bills that are coming into cities. Like what's the electricity bill for the city of Edinburgh? What percentage of that electricity bill is tourism? I'm sure we probably don't know that. And that's exactly what you need to know if you want to start lowering your greenhouse gas emissions, if you want to look at how can you make tourism more efficient and how much can tourism contribute to the green transition. So those are things that we think are not, we're not talking about big brains that can only manage this. It's just that no one is managing it this way.
Let's go down to the last one there. How do you convince public purse holders that the city needs more investment in tourism rather than less, which seems to be happening in Edinburgh?
Yeah.
Political?
It's a good question. I think that one of the things we've talked about is, while I'm here, is looking at what is the value of Edinburgh itself, just as an example, to the economy. It's called valuation. Valuation, I heard this from Aileen, has been done for the Sydney Opera House, where it shows the value of that asset to Sydney. It's just the way a business would look at valuation for any major facility that they have. So your assets, we're calling your destination historical monuments and museums, are actually assets that can be put into spreadsheets in a different way with valuation that will show your decision makers, in theory, that in fact, not only should they not be cutting, but they should be considering new forms of investment platforms.
Okay. What would holistic accounting look like, consist of in Edinburgh? Yeah,
as I was saying, it's basically many of the costs will relate to your utilities. Right, so I think that's clear. You have water, waste, electricity, all of those are in bills that are already being received. And then the question is, well, what is that costing, and what will that cost in future, and how do you manage those costs? But then there's the sociocultural costs. Those are a little bit more complex. They basically look at, as I was saying, metrics of how much local citizens are perceiving, say, crowding and congestion, or other issues of overuse of public spaces that local citizens use. These are things that you're hearing complaints about that you can't really ignore, is my recommendation. If people are feeling that they are completely being crowded out by visitors, they're going to start to complain more and more. So the most important thing is to measure those concerns consistently using indicators over the time and build that into GIS metrics so that you can start to see where the trouble spots are. When it comes to the Airbnb properties, we really think that GIS can help because you would be able to interactively look at where those are changing and where they're putting so much pressure that entire neighborhoods are all Airbnb property, while others are not. And that's where legislators and regulators can look at this on an ongoing basis just to try and manage how much of this growth of the sharing, or what do you don't call it the sharing economy, but the Booking.com Airbnb economy is impacting your neighborhoods. You can measure those things. So that's what holistic accounting looks like.
And the last one, do you think that the decision on requirements for sustainable infrastructure should be done at a local or a national level?
That's a really good question. I think that you have to have the measurements at the local level, and then there has to be a national conversation.
Okay. Well, Megan, thank you very much. Fascinating presentation.